Hey, Devon, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Glad to be here.
So, when we get together, and I don't know why this started, we always tend to talk about physics. And I guess it's because nobody else wants to talk to us about it.
Which I don't
So,
understand. I feel like, physics should be, just a average, you ask somebody about the weather, you ask about, the latest, physics trends that people are going through, what you're seeing and going through any other aspect there.
and there's so much quantum physics in our space, right? I mean, ask you about retro causality. So this whole or backwards causation, but this whole notion that something in the future can change the past, and want to get your hot take on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because causality in general and like how that affects the conversation around time, right? So then the easiest way that I've always kind of thought about this is let's go back to like thermodynamics, right? Entropy has to increase with the system, right? So you start talking about causation being caused by something in the future, you're basically breaking some of those fundamental things of what a closed system is on how entropy has to increase. And so whenever you start talking about how things in the future start affecting, things that happened before it, it's like, okay, what's my closed system that I'm looking at? And that's where you really start getting into physics is, where do you kind of draw that boundary so you can understand what, how the problem you're trying to solve is.
Yeah.
But, how that starts, going through that becomes really interesting to say, okay, if things in the future, that retro causality can actually affect that, how do I actually, understand what came first, right? What does first even mean anymore?
Yeah, is it linear
Defining
anymore?
exactly, yeah. Right. And it just becomes this very weird thing to kind of think through of, even when we talk about, relativity from, okay, speed of light's constant, but when an event happens, right, that's still observable, that, that event and the causation happens in the same order. So even though time, can go through at different speeds, the
Yeah.
order has always been the same, right? The cause always, precedes the effect. So trying to really wrap your head around that, it's one of those areas that there are a few areas of physics in particular that you almost have to trust the math, right? You get to a point where your intuition is very hard to kind of wrap your head around, a fundamental understanding. So you almost have to follow through the math.
Yeah, quantum physics, time travel,
yeah,
multiple infinity. For backwards causation, I think of like the grandfather paradox. If Devon travels back in time and he finds his grandfather, and Devon pulls out his sterilization gun, because that's a thing in my dystopian future universe, and sterilizes his grandfather, then his mother or father aren't born. Does that mean Devon disappears, right? And can't get back on his DeLorean and make it back home? But yeah, it's quantum physics is one of those things where just that topic we could sit on for hours. But
yeah.
But Devon, we've known each other for a long time. Certainly you predated me at Verodin as one of the original and core engineers of the entire solution. But perhaps you could give our audience a little bit of background about how you came up and sort of what you've done and what it is you do now.
Sure. So it may not surprise anyone since we started talking on the physics background. So my undergrad actually was in engineering, physics, and math. So, very much started in that very engineering focus, kind of that, going through from like practical engineering all the way back to first principles, right? That's what I always kind of enjoyed, right? How do you kind of explain the very basic, concepts and build into these more, evolved aspects? Through that led to a lot of testing, got into, doing electrical engineering, radio frequency work, communication, and then ultimately, got into cybersecurity because of how all these pieces start coming together. So as you start building up complex systems, you try and understand how they interact, how you go through that, how you test, how you do interoperability, kept, coming back to cybersecurity and how you kind of start guaranteeing what that looks like. That's how I got into that space, went into threat intelligence for a while, focused on what you can know, what you can see, how you observe going through those aspects. Even went through automated, binary reversing for a little while, just trying to understand, what you can do in an automated fashion to understand about something you've seen for the first time, right? Going through reverse engineering, understanding where user input traces through an application from that perspective. And then, yeah, ultimately ended up with Verodin. Back in 2015, came in as part of the seed round, got to build out the validation engineering team, really got excited about this idea of bringing a engineering testing concept to the cybersecurity space, right? How do you actually do what had been more traditionally kind of a, an engineering practice of a system engineering, of stepping through and really kind of measuring, understanding, kind of validating each kind of assumption you've got into, the evolving space that, is just new in a lot of ways and constantly trying to keep up with the latest technology, latest attacks, and going through that, and really taking those same concepts that we have in other fields and applying that kind of same rigor here in cybersecurity. So that's kind of what got me excited about it, got to this point.
Yeah. It always amazes me. And I've had a number of people on this program with, diverse backgrounds, you with a physics, electrical engineering, mathematics background. I've had folks with degrees in biology and English and various areas within liberal arts, and just came up through so many different directions. And our space, cybersecurity, is such a rich tapestry of backgrounds and experiences. I think it's probably one of the few industries probably where you have such a varied background, because not a lot of people come up specifically with a computer science / cybersecurity specialty that get into this space. Some do, especially now, but historically it wasn't the case. So that's really interesting. So you've been exposed to cybersecurity and intelligence from a lot of different angles. How have you seen threats sort of evolve in that time period? And a follow-up question to that is, how have you seen organizations, because I know you spend a lot of time in the field with customers as well, how have you seen organizations adapt to those changing threats?
Yeah. So the threatscape, like the threat landscape in general, has really started to kind of evolve in kind of an interesting fashion, right? Probably there's no better example, in my mind of, how this has kind of evolved into looking at like where ransomware as a service came from, right? You're basically talking about actors and groups, taking, cybercrime and making that their fundamental business and offering, to do that for other groups. It's like, this is becoming an ecosystem of going through this, right? This is basically like, okay, this is taking like almost like a mafia or mob type concept of, hey, we're going to own, what crime looks like. And by the way, we'll go do this for you. You just pick the target. Here's what you pay us. Here's what we go through that. We're talking about, groups at this point that have mission statements on who they target, what their financials are meant to look like, what the different kind of price points they're going to charge people depending on the customer they're going after. Like, that's insane to think, how, crime has become that level of a business, right? That this has evolved from, okay, somebody's trying to hack in, maybe to, deface something, from an hacktivist, going through and saying, hey, I don't agree with this company, so then I'm going after them. From the early days of just, hey, it's the wild, wild west, so this could be a script kiddie that, just somebody's out there, trying to run something and going through that. It's very much becoming an actual business. And I think, as the money keeps going through that, as ransomware gets paid out, you keep seeing this evolution of, this constant building on capability, on ecosystem, on just this, repeatable process of trying to basically grow of, where the crime parts of, security get into. So that's been very interesting, right? Just kind of that ecosystem, that component. On top of that, you're seeing more and more kind of brazen attacks from, kind of, nation state actors, right? The supply chain component. It's something that I think a lot of people have talked about for a while, getting into what does that look like to actually get into the supply chain, to actually, compromise a larger organization. Doing it at that scale just is not something that, people would typically have said, you would have gotten into. It's one of those things of, once you kind of open that can of worms, how do you control it? How do you stop it? And it's like, okay, you're basically seeing groups that are willing to, send things out that can have unintended consequences, not be able to control what they're sending, and then, hoping that they can kind of reel in the parts they want to touch on. So that kind of evolving thought process of, hey, we're kind of increasing what, warfare looks like in cyberspace, has definitely been something that's kind of keep growing. And so seeing how that gets addressed with policy, how people are start talking about, what you can do proactively, that's going to be an interesting space in general. But, 100% seeing some of that. Mm-hmm. So as far as organizations, I think a lot of organizations are having to address, especially, just talking about the ransomware, because I think that's going to be top of mind for everybody for quite a while, just on where that's going. How do you start addressing risk, and how do you start talking about risk from a business perspective? At this point, it's hard for any company to say they're not a cyber company of some sort, right? Every company has some level of tech at this point. It's very hard to be a company that doesn't exist on the internet anymore. It's not practical. So at this point, a core part of every business is tied to their ability to do business online, be connected, have their operations, track through these components, and all that aspect is just, fundamental to their ability to deliver whatever, that business is kind of in. So what we're seeing and what we're kind of seeing in this evolution is that we can no longer have cybersecurity as a secondary conversation, right? You've got to have a seat at the board. You've got to have that executive conversation. You've got to talk about risk from business operations, from being compromised, from having your entire system locked out at a fundamental level with how you do business. And so as we're seeing these components, as we're seeing organizations try and understand where they focus on, we're seeing a lot more of that kind of risk, kind of thought process going into business. So I think that's important. And I think that's kind of where things have to evolve of, having cyber, security kind of as a first topic. We're talking about, building a business now, talking about new operations, talking about mergers and acquisitions. We go through all these aspects. So that's where I'm seeing a lot of the trending, from an overall business strategy is just, it's got to be there at the beginning. If you don't have that as one of the critical drivers of, when we're having a conversation about any kind of high level decision, then you end up having to kind of make up for it in the past. So that's where I see a lot of the business pieces going. That's where I see, more trending over time, but just that focus, I think, is going to continue to grow just because of the impact we're seeing, across the industry, globally, just everywhere. We're kind of, seeing more and more of it.
Yeah, it's interesting how the parallels between the threats and the organizational responses are really wrapped into maturation, into being more strategic, more tied to financials, et cetera, juxtaposed to I'm going to deface a web page or do a DDoS attack. And I think about these criminal organizations, either small or large, that are maybe in non-extradition countries or maybe in countries where they have safe harbor. Perhaps there's not opportunities to do other things with their degrees. A lot of these people, it's easy to have this Hollywood image of the hacker in his mom's basement drinking joke cola and playing video games. Not to say that that doesn't exist somewhere somehow, or at least historically did. But you're talking about people with, PhDs in engineering or economics running these organizations, and these are people that if they're working for a Fortune 100 company, probably would be doing awesome, but they don't have these opportunities. So you put that kind of brain power and drive and tenacity behind a group of individuals. Maybe they started off as criminals or became criminals later on. That's a powerful threat, right? That's a very determined aggressor. And then the same side organizations then have to take it up to the, as you said, you've got stakeholders and shareholders and boards and C-level executives that need to understand this risk in the wave of all the other risks that they're looking at. Risks of opening up businesses in new markets, risk of adopting new products, risk of hiring this individual. There's so many different business risks. Cyber's just one. And I guess there's good and bad to that, right? I think we've up-leveled it to the point we wanted to, but the aggressors have equally up-leveled as well. So it's, I guess it's offense versus defense and defense versus offense. We have to find that balance point.
That constant cat and mouse game, right? Yeah, right? You're just constantly building through that. But no, I think that kind of concept of, everything we have to talk about now is that global scale. So I like that kind of opportunity conversation you're having, right? The opportunities are still not uniform. And so you've got people, in, certain region or something like that, we're still going to, in some cases, an office building, right? To run their, their cyber business that just happens to be a cyber crime business, going through that. It's just like, how do you start recapturing those resources to get people back, into that space? But that's a whole other topic for another day.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk about, because I think this lines up with that well. So the Verodin platform, of course, we've gone from Verodin to now we're called Mandiant Security Validation, and it's part of the larger Mandiant Advantage solution. But being that, again, you were one of the original designers early on, how have you seen Verodin sort of change and adapt and morph, especially now that it's part of the Mandiant Advantage solution?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, from the beginning, we knew we wanted to be able to provide data, right? We wanted to focus on evidence-based, components, driving through that, so that was where our focus was. How do you actually kind of test and go through that? what I've seen evolve is, what you can test and the quality and level of that data and kind of expertise you're able to bring to bear. So when we first got started, we brought, the cyber experience we had, going through that, running through aspects. You can test an IOC, you can test some basic TTPs of, how a technique, an actor may be using. But what I've really started to see is this focus and this shift in this conversation from just a single data point into an outcome. And an important part of like shifting to an outcome conversation is, how do I start scoping and understanding what that looks like? And one of the key aspects of that is, better intel. And so once we were able to kind of combine the Verodin piece, through the FireEye acquisition, working with, the Mandiant Advantage platform, bringing the intel side of that house to bear of, I'm not telling you, hey, here's something that's, a new technique that you should try out because it's neat and, nobody's tried to do this before, right? This is something that, is, the shiny object, want to run through that. Still good to be able to test those things, but instead we're having a conversation around, I know I care about these actor groups, right? I know that this is what is targeting my industry. I know this is what my peers are getting hit with. I'm now going to run that same set in my environment. I'm now going to run that in multiple different places. I'm now going to test in my sensitive server area, this actual, compromise that, somebody else went through. Being able to take, real examples from incident response data and say, here is what actually happened. Here's how this group pivoted. Here's how long it took them, to get through this other environment. Here's the initial entry point, and actually be able to use those practical pieces to not only, test your technology, but also help train your people.
Yeah, you're personalizing, right? You're personalizing.
Exactly.
You're taking raw intelligence, and you're saying, how does this impact me specifically on my production network?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in your words, and I, we both know the marketing, but I'd like to hear your perspective. What exactly is Mandiant Advantage, and what's your take on why it's so unique compared to the millions of other security solutions out there in the market?
Absolutely. So, when I like to think about Mandiant Advantage, I like to think about it in the same way that, I think about a lot of different areas, right? You get a lot of value from innovation when you do cross-boundary conversations, right? When you can bring multiple different siloed approaches together, you tend to get a lot of, value in it from an innovation kind of conversation, right? You take any kind of field you think about, just from my background, taking, biology or animal processes, right? How swarms of, behaviors, get used into machine learning, touching on those aspects, that innovation of being able to take, concepts from one area, apply them and reuse them and bring all that together is very important. So what's important for me from an advantage perspective is we're trying to break down what have been, silos and capabilities to bring expertise to kind of drive that outcome, right? So taking intel, taking our validation, taking our automated defense, and really bringing all those pieces together to say, here's what a full story looks like. Here's what everything that Mandiant can bring to you from an expert perspective. And you almost want to think of it as, if I had an expert, if I had somebody that this is everything they have been doing, they've touched on all these fields, what would they be able to do with this, kind of aspects, and kind of tying those components together. So bringing all that to a common story, a common outcome, a common kind of business driver gives us a lot of ability to kind of innovate in ways we couldn't touch on previously. So that's for me where, it becomes very interesting, right? Where the boundaries come together, right? Where you're able to break down those silos and really start saying, I'm pivoting from a response into, an actual, an action being taken. And then I'm using that action being taken to say, I want to understand broader, what this means in an intel conversation, and being able to have a seamless ability to transition that life cycle, becomes very, kind of key. And I think it's going to be a big driver in general, just as we see, everyone's kind of hitting this, right? From a staffing, not being able to kind of keep, have enough people, with the skill set you're looking for, drive all those components. So having expertise that you can kind of call on that spreads across multiple different pieces becomes a key differentiator there.
Yeah, the idea of sort of a service enabled or service driven SaaS, I think is such a big change in the space. We're finally moving beyond just tools I've got some tools, I'm going to buy some new tools, and later on I'm going to buy some new tools. We're actually saying it's not just the tools. Of course you want good tools, but it's the intelligence and it's the people and services behind those tools that really make them unique, right? It's kind of like a mobile phone. It's just some glass and electronics. It's all the stuff that feeds it that makes it, valuable, the apps and everything else and connectivity. So that's where I think we're moving to, which I think is going to be a big change. Not that I don't think products are going away, but I just think the way we think about them, especially now that we're embracing the cloud and the merger of services and intelligence and products, such a big change in the space, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it, right? Which is, products aren't going away, but you can have the same product set. I can take company A and company B that literally have bought the exact same things, right? You go look through their security stack, everything they've purchased, you go compare it, and it's like they've bought, line for line, every single thing exactly the same.
Yeah.
The difference is, how do they actually, apply their intelligence expertise and how it's configured, how it's deployed, how that all comes together. So 100%, I think, as you're saying, products don't go away, but they become part of a broader story of it's not just the products, it's how they're used and how you can actually, bring that to bear, at the problems you're trying to get into.
Let's drill down on that a little bit more. Let's talk more about customers. So we've talked about Mandiant Advantage and how that's evolved in the intelligence and the people behind that and the services component, but how the customers actually changed now that they have this type of capability in front of them.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think, as we're kind of talking, customers in general are becoming more from a lot of what we're seeing, more kind of a risk-based conversation, right? How do you kind of take this to the next level? How do you start getting into an outcome-driven conversation? So with Advantage, what we're seeing a lot from a customer kind of evolution is how do they take what could have been like a paper compliance activity previously and start being able to put real data and expertise to that.
Yes.
I know I care about this. I know I want to, go through that, but I'm not comfortable in the fact of, I went through and wrote this down on paper that, this is how things work. How do I actually feel good about, this is the reality of what's going through that. And so being able to tie that into, okay, the reason I have this compliance activity is because I'm, worried about, this actor group. I'm worried about, being able to protect my business, from, these kinds of behaviors. And then being able to then show, here's what it would look like if this actually happened. And by the way, here's how we're filtering down this mass amount of events and other pieces that we're bringing in so that I can focus and have my people, actually going through the pieces that are actually mattering to me. That alignment, with the platform and bringing that expertise is one of the, probably key things I think that, are going to be critical for business going forward, right? We know resources are going to be more limited. We know, time, becomes of the essence. Money becomes an issue. So how do I become more efficient overall? And so I think that's where a lot of the businesses are going.
Yeah, and it's such a novel concept. Unfortunately, it's novel. It shouldn't be. But the idea that I can weaponize my compliance and regulatory mandates to actually make my organization more secure, as opposed to just placating my auditors. So when they come through, they can check the right box, and I feel good about. You're actually saying, look, we got to do this anyways. So why don't we get some value out of it? And I don't think that's a new idea, but I think now with the automation capabilities and the way of leveraging this, it's kind of changed the field. Let's talk about surprises. Has anything surprised you about how customers are or are thinking about leveraging Mandiant Advantage?
I think the surprises that what typically surprises me, and it probably shouldn't, right? Because I've seen it enough time, is how quickly customers can kind of adapt, in that space, right? Because you go into some of our customers, you're talking, large enterprises, right? You're talking, going through a lot of, regulatory components, a lot of, kind of, hey, we've been doing this, this way for a while now. This is what we're kind of, this is our process. How quickly, many of them are able to kind of take this and say, hey, this is a good idea. I'm now going to focus on this and, really jump in and, kind of get, this part of my process, right? Being able to quickly adapt their process to say, here's where I, traditionally struggled. This took too long. Once they're able to say, hey, this is actually going to provide me, not having to, waste what is a very, limited resource for me, repeating the same activity. But now I can bring this expertise in an automated way, bring this component into my environment, make that part of my process. I've been a little bit surprised, just how quickly you can see that kind of adoption, right? How quickly all of a sudden it's goes from a conversation of, hey, that's a great idea, to, within a couple months, hey, this is actually our new standard practice, right? Seeing a company talk about, hey, before we're going to do our next merger and acquisition, we're going to go through, and actually evaluate them, put real data through that, take our intel components, drive through that, and make an intelligent decision on going through that. And I think that ability to adapt where business needs to be, is something that, again, I think surprises me on how quickly, sometimes people move through that.
That's a good point. And I don't think we take enough time to, I don't know, congratulate's the right word, but recognize maybe what these organizations are doing. I mean, so of course with Mandiant, we work with every type of financial services or federal or state government or oil and gas industry or technology or healthcare and everything in between. Nobody's in business to say we're the most secure bank in the world, or we've got the best cybersecurity out of all the oil and gas companies. That's not in your mission statement. So, you've got these teams that are trying to support the business drivers. And on top of that, they have to make sure security, to your point earlier, is top of mind. It's being discussed in the boardroom and with the executives, stakeholders, shareholders, et cetera. And they've had to pivot so fast because, go back 15, 20 years ago, the people that they were defending against it was like the high school JV team. And then it kind of went up to varsity, and then maybe a college team, then a Division I. Well, now they're playing in the pros because the bad guys, they've weaponized, they've operationalized, they've gone to that level, and they're still putting up the good fight. And to that cat and mouse thing, it doesn't stop. But I don't think we take enough time to recognize that and how quickly they do have to pivot. And thankfully there are some good security vendors out there that are providing solutions that actually help them do this. So it's fun to be part of that.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about just a couple of use cases, because you spend a lot of time in the field, again, with customers, with partners, across different verticals. You're seeing how people are using these solutions, what works, what doesn't. Can you share like one or two business or technical examples of how people are leveraging these solutions and getting value?
Sure. I'll probably start with a more technical one, then we can kind of, go through a business one as well. So from kind of a technical use case, one of the first things we kind of talk about, especially, with the, automated defense, part of Mandiant, is just understanding how do you kind of escalate, the things that a traditional, level 1 SOC analyst would kind of, have to deal with, right? How do you start getting through the massive amount of data that we've gone through? We've almost reversed that problem, right? Before, you got into the SIM space, all those components, it was, I don't have all the data that I need, it's not all in the same place, how do I go through that? Now we're starting to get into this other problem space, which is I've got too much data, right? I've sent all the stuff in. So from a technical use case, what we're seeing inside of the Advantage platform as, kind of an example is I may have something that, would have traditionally been a weak signal, something that I may not have seen, right? Something is suspicious in my server zone, but it's not at the level where it's like, okay, this is going to be my top one, tier, alert that I'm immediately going to have somebody going through, right? There's something going through that. Now, the nice thing is, since we're looking at all those events, all that data, this gets raised up to say, hey, you should pay attention to this, right? We're now pulling that needle out of the haystack, with that automated defense to say, this is something that's going on in something you've identified as a customer, as a sensitive part of your environment. You should pay attention to that. So what's nice is now an analyst can hop in there, take a look at that. And let's say, for example, that this is some sort of, behavior that's reaching out to an asset on the internet. You've never seen this IP, this domain before, and you immediately take a look at that. And we're able to say, hey, this isn't associated necessarily with a group yet, but this is an uncategorized, group that we're tracking that seems to be using this asset, right? And so all of a sudden, I'm changing that story from, I don't know what was happening, something I was missing, to now something's going on. And by the way, Mandiant's tracking, a group loosely that's associated using this resource. Now let me take a look and say, what else is this, group doing? What other techniques are they using? Is this something that's broader in my enterprise that I just, I'm now just seeing this initial foothold that goes through that. So we can pivot into that intel conversation, immediately say, what is this group focusing on? Why would they be looking at me? What other techniques are they looking for? What's their motivation? What should I be going through? Now, with that information, now that I'm kind of armed and saying, hey, I saw something suspicious, I know, who this kind of suspicious, activity is related to, what can I now test in my environment? And so now I can kick off other techniques, and I can say, let's actually dry run. If this group is in my environment, what am I going to see? What would actually happen, as they were kind of trying to compromise and go through their normal behavior. And so being able to speed that process up from a, hey, something might be suspicious, all the way to here's data on how I would actually respond, is one of the key aspects underneath Advantage. And so what we end up seeing a lot of times in a use case like that is maybe I run through that, and best case scenario, I get an alert out, everything's firing, everything looks great. I'm like, okay, I feel confident that if this group hit my enterprise, I'm protected, I'm doing the right things. What we typically find is, hey, I just ran that, I didn't see that alert, or that alert didn't get in for 6 hours. Is there something that I need to take a look at? Is there something I don't have turned on? Is there a configuration that's missing? Right, those quick ability to then say, I need to then up my game and what I'm looking at, and maybe even get into a threat hunting type conversation, right? Of, I'm going to take this and actually now search for anywhere else from that IOC perspective that I'm going through that. Because all of a sudden I go from a, hey, I'm not quite sure, to, hey guys, we've got an actual problem, because I'm seeing multiple different points throughout our enterprise talking to assets related to one group. So that's a very key kind of ability to quickly bring that expertise and intel from kind of that more technical use case. The business use case can be very varied, right? And I think we've talked about some of them already, right? Which is kind of going beyond compliance, right? Going beyond a framework as a, hey, I'm talking about compliance or an audit as a, this is something I have to do, but I don't actually feel like it provides me any value. So as we get into a risk conversation, as we start getting into business use cases, being able to actually say, I'm going to test, against these, 5 actor groups, and this is how I'm going to prove compliance in my environment, before I'm going to, sign off on, buying a new, location, right? Expanding, this operation, being able to then drive those decisions. That's a lot of what we're seeing from kind of a business perspective, right? How do you actually start bringing this to the next level? I mean, at a fundamental aspect, just having that basic understanding across the board of being able to kind of take that whole baseline of, here is what I expect to be doing, here's what I want to test against, and being able to do that on an ongoing basis instead of that single point in time. That's a huge aspect, just from kind of that business use case conversation of taking a I always talk about the data. It's the most valuable as soon as you are done collecting it, right? Anytime you've gone through that, it doesn't get any more valuable from that single point in time. It starts decaying over time as to that value. So that a constant ability to kind of refresh and going through that, and so making that part of their official process, official part of their business. That's a big aspect we're kind of seeing with the kind of Advantage, and Mandiant, as a whole.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, it starts to really align cybersecurity with key strategic business initiatives. Because to your point, if we have data that's 2 years old when we're trying to make a business decision or a technical decision, it's probably not worth anything at all at that point. Yep. So being able to do things quickly in an automated fashion certainly makes a big difference. And that was amazing, Devon. That was great information. And before I let you go, sort of any final thoughts you'd like to leave with everybody today?
I think I'm definitely excited about the space. I know you are as well, Brian. Which is just bringing together siloed parts of cybersecurity, how we think about business, and how we start making this a an outcome comprehensive solution. Yeah. Taking this back to an engineering perspective, right? I can't do a trade-off analysis, right? I can't actually have a a focused, intelligent conversation unless I can bring all the data points together when I'm making those decisions. Yeah. So I think bringing that space, front and center, being able to actually be able to say, here's where my expertise is, right? Here's where the intel is up to date, understanding what I look like as an enterprise, and making that part of the conversation, is definitely probably the thing I'm the most excited about, right? Just kind of up leveling, how we're talking about cyber in general.
Yep. Well, great punctuation on the end of some awesome information. Thanks so much for taking some time today, and really appreciate having you on the show.
Thanks for the invite.
Take care.